Hello, I'm Dr. Jessica Dodge-Overstreet. Thank you so much for joining me for this, which is part 2 of our score study of the first movement of Jeanine Rueff's Saxophone Sonata. Last time we looked at the broad strokes, trying to find the beginnings and ends of sections and figuring out what tools Rueff used to delineate those sections, namely space, changes in character, and repetition. This time we're going to go a little bit deeper and look at those sections and try and figure out how this is constructed, how it fits within the confines of sonata form despite not being tonal, and some other cool things like what's going on with that opening motive and what's going on with pitch content throughout the entirety of it. So without much further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Like I said before, this is a slightly more advanced level of music theory, so if you've never taken a music theory class, there are probably going to be some terms that you haven't met yet. I'm going to do my best to explain them as we go, but feel free to ask any questions you may have in the comments. Alright, so now we're watching a time-lapse of me writing in all of the sections that we found last time into a notebook so that I can compare them without having to flip through all 4 pages. I'm starting with the exposition. I'm going to skip the development because it doesn't have a specific structure and then go straight to the recapitulation. It's also worth noting that this piece does have a brief coda. We'll talk about it when we talk about that opening motive. Okay, so we are now looking at the exposition sections that we just did in the time-lapse, and I want to point out a couple things. You probably noticed that I started with this little motive here and then put this ellipses because there's more at the back end of it, and the next time that little motive comes back, it changes at the back end. And not only does it change, it's what we would call an inversion. So from here, where it goes up, up, this goes down, down, and then this goes up, and this comes down, and this goes down, and this comes up. This is just flipping the direction of the pitches to create a new theme, which I think is really interesting. So Rueff has used an inversional relationship between this first and third theme, but there's also an inversional relationship between the second and fourth section. So you can see we have ascending, and then ascending, descending, and descending. Everything is flopped. So this allows her to create related material, but if you didn't know this, you might not have known that those were inversions of each other because the sound is not like immediately related to our ears. Moving on to those bottom 2 sections, they're actually not inversionally related, and we can talk if you have questions about how I sliced this last section. Last time we just kind of left it as one big section, but it is also kind of divided in half using those same tactics that she used to divide the larger sections. But what I think is interesting here is you can see that this first half is full of large leaps of almost an octave, and then this next one only has these really, really small half and whole steps, which I think is still kind of an inversion of how she's creating this. So large leaps versus very small leaps. Now, if I open this up and we see the exposition and the recapitulation next to each other, we can start to notice some kind of interesting things. You can see that the sections don't crop up in the same place that we would maybe expect for them to. So whereas we would normally expect for all of these themes to crop up in the exact same order in the exposition and the recapitulation, that's not what's happening here. This opening theme, and remember, look at this back half, that's a little bit more reliable, that doesn't come until the 4th slot over here. And from there, it's actually pretty nicely reversed. So we have this theme right here, and these two and these two are at the same pitch level as they were in the opening. I did follow, in the score that I have at least, she goes straight to D flat here instead of having a C sharp that transforms into D flat, but it's the same theme, right? And then if we continue to move up and down, we notice that this one, where we have this descending figure, well, now this is at a different pitch level, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but for now we're just noticing this is at a different pitch level. And same thing here, we've got those same motions, but yet again, they're different pitch levels. If we look at that bottom one, they both crop up in the bottom, but they've still swapped. So we have our half steps first and our big leaps second. So because they're connected when they show up in this way and they've just swapped spots, I'm inclined to connect 1 and 2 as one cohesive theme, 3 and 4 as one cohesive theme, and 5 as 6 as one cohesive theme. And in sonata theory, we're expecting 3 theme groups at the beginning. We're expecting a primary theme group, we're expecting a secondary theme group, and we're expecting a closing zone or closing theme group. We use a K instead of a C because K is not a letter of the musical alphabet, and so we're not going to accidentally confuse that with the musical alphabet letter C. And what does this mean, having P, S, and K? This comes from Hepikowski and Darcy's sonata theory if you want to know more. Sonata theory is typically covered in about your third semester of music theory classes. But essentially, these are themes that we would expect to see in this order, and we don't really get the traditional sense of what happens. In a very traditional sonata form, we're expecting a home key, a transition in here, which we don't really get, a new key, our secondary key for this, and then when we get the recapitulation, they should all be in the home key. There's this very strong tonal plan that goes with sonata form. But if we look in the recapitulation, well, first, we're not getting the themes in the same order. They're still grouped in those sections, but they're all reversed, the order. And then we don't get that P formation first, because if you look back, the P formation has this ascending figure and ascending figure, but we get the two descending figures. So we get S first. This is called a reverse recapitulation, if you're curious, and it becomes more popular in the 20th century because of the symmetry it creates, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So we get our ascending shapes, which were associated with P, and then K doesn't change positions, but it is internally rotated, right? The part that comes second comes first. So between the exposition and the recapitulation, each of these swap places within the theme itself, and then the primary and secondary theme group swap places in general. So what this creates, if we ignore K, if we just look at the top, is it creates this symmetry. This is the first thing we hear, and it's also the last thing that we hear, and it goes back like this. It creates this kind of mirror image. This symmetry becomes a big aesthetic interest in the 20th century in lieu of kind of tonal maps where we don't have a tonal map here. But also we can see here that we've got this little section here that doesn't invert either way. This remains constant, and this is a point of some interest. So we're going to switch over to looking back at the score, and we're going to look at all of these instances and try to map out where they're occurring and at what pitch level and what that means for the overall piece. All right, so we have this repeating motive over and over, and it starts at the beginning, and we get it a couple times in each of the big sections. We have the exposition, where we get it twice. In the development, we also get it twice. And in the recap, we actually get it 3 times. And if we look at each of those, the very first one is right here. And for pitch level, I'm just going to use the first note. So it starts on a B, and it's consistent, like we already said. It doesn't invert, so we can use B as a reliable starting point. The next time it happens, it's already labeled as right here. It's also at the pitch level that begins with a B. Moving on to the next page. We can see down here at the bottom, this is the first iteration of it in the development, and you can see that it's a B sharp. We've moved up a half step. And then we turn the page and see it again in the development with an E sharp. Then we get it back in the recap at the level of an E. And then on the last page, we get it 2 more times. At the top, we finally get it back at the pitch level of B. And then at the very end, we get it again at the pitch level starting on B, but I'm going to put a little ABA because this is the first time it's that high. So what is this telling us? What are we seeing here? If we just compare the motion from the beginning of one iteration of this to the next, of course these are the same, but between these two, we have up a half step, and between these two, we have up a perfect fourth. Then, between the next two, we have down a half step, and between the next two, we have down a perfect fourth. So we can see that there's this rising motion leading us into the development and through the development, but then coming back into the recapitulation, we actually kind of sit down and settle down, back down a half step, and then down a fourth to our original starting point. And this might seem kind of inconsequential, but we can also see it in the highest pitches that we're seeing. So starting here on the last page, you can see that the highest note on this page, but at the end, is an F. And then if we look at the start of the development, end of the exposition, we can see the highest pitch in the entire piece, which is this F sharp. And of course, if we back it up all the way to the beginning, the highest pitch in that first iteration of this is, yet again, an F. So this tracks. We have this overall trajectory of rising up through the development and then settling back down. This is not unlike those half-step key changes in pop songs. You might think of Beyonce's Love on Top, where as she continues to ascend, there's an injection of energy. The same thing is happening here. In the development, this ascent by a half step is designed to kind of push the energy up, and then it settles down into the recapitulation. This can be helpful to map this overall arc of the energy instead of just pushing, pushing, pushing. So there is this pushing in the development, but then there's kind of this settling down in the recapitulation. So we've looked a lot at different things in there. We've seen that repeating motive that kind of shows us the map of the piece. And I think it's really clever that she doesn't invert this, because as I said when we first talked about inversion, you can kind of lose the identity of a theme when it's in inversion, which works really well when she's using the same material to create the primary and secondary theme groups. But if you want some repetition in this to kind of guide your listener, that relationship might not be obvious. So by keeping this first almost introduction to that main theme, by keeping that a consistent, non-inverted little motive, she's creating repetition, which is really helpful in this style of music because it can be difficult to hang your hat onto other things. So having that little bit of repetition can really help hang your hat on something, especially as a listener, whereas flipping at things and inverting them creates this kind of interesting flowing form that germinates from not as much material as you might expect. When you're practicing this and when you're working on this, you can use your knowledge of how these themes are constructed to decide how related you want them to be and how separate you want them to be. Normally, between P and S, there's quite a bit of difference. Here, the only difference between P and S is the inversion level, really, and except for that motive that doesn't invert. But you can decide, do you want these themes to sound like they're really, really closely related because they're based on the same material? Or do you want to highlight how even though they're the same material inverted, they sound different and they have different energies and aesthetics? In addition, knowing where the recapitulation starts and how the recapitulation is reversed, you can decide, do you want to really mark the beginning of the recapitulation so that everybody knows that you've arrived to that recapitulation? Or much in the way that that opening theme waits until P, and not just P, but the original half of P that came first. Do you want to wait all the way until there and build all the way towards there, where that energy finally settles into that opening theme? Knowing how things are constructed can give you a lot of freedom and a lot of agency in how you decide to shape these things with a reason behind it. And I think that, at least for me personally, helps me give a more compelling performance of it. So thank you so much for watching all the way through to the end. I hope you learned something new about this piece today. Please subscribe if you would like future videos and leave me a comment letting me know what piece I should do next.